June 6, 1944. Omaha Beach, Normandy. The first German engineer to examine the wreckage on Omaha Beach arrived on the afternoon of June 7th, 24 hours after the Allied landings. His name was Hauptmann Werner Schulze, a 32-year-old logistics officer from the organization Todt, trained at the Technical University of Berlin, veteran of construction projects from the Atlantic Wall to the frozen steppes of Russia. He had been summoned from his post in Caen to assess the battlefield, to determine what the Allies had brought ashore, to estimate their capabilities. He walked slowly through the sand, past the burned-out hulks of landing craft, past the bodies still being collected, past the German pillboxes now silent and shattered. And then he stopped. Scattered across the beach, half buried in sand or bobbing in the surf, were supply containers. Hundreds of them. Thousands. Waterproof crates stenciled with American markings. Jerrycans, the Germans' own design, copied and improved by the Americans, filled with gasoline. Wooden pallets stacked with ammunition boxes, ration cartons, medical supplies, spare parts, engineering equipment. The scale was incomprehensible. This was not the supply train of an invading army. This was the output of an industrial civilization, delivered to a hostile shore in a single day. Schulze knelt beside one crate and pried it open. Inside, packed in greaseproof paper, were 20 identical carburetors for M4 Sherman tanks. 20. Identical. He opened another crate. Radio tubes, hundreds of them, each nestled in individual cardboard dividers. Another crate. Boots, all the same size, all brand new. Another. Cigarettes, coffee, chocolate bars, chewing gum. He stood and looked down the beach, at the endless line of crates stretching toward the waterline, and he felt something close to despair. Later, in his official report to Wehrmacht High Command, he wrote, "The Americans have not merely landed an army, they have landed an economy. If they can sustain this rate of supply, the war is already lost." To understand why Werner Schulze felt that despair, one must understand the nature of modern warfare. Wars are not won by courage alone, nor by superior tactics, nor even by better weapons. Wars are won by logistics, by the ability to move men and materiel from factories to front lines, to keep armies fed and fueled and armed, to replace losses faster than the enemy can inflict them. Logistics is the mathematics of war, and by 1944, the Americans had perfected the equation. Germany had once been a master of logistics. The German General Staff, inheritors of Prussian military tradition, had built their reputation on meticulous planning, on railroad timetables synchronized to the minute, on the ability to mobilize millions of men with clockwork precision. The invasion of France in 1940 had been a logistical masterpiece, a ballet of tanks and trucks and supply columns moving through the Ardennes with such speed and coordination that the French and British could not react in time. The world had watched in awe. But that was 1940. By 1944, Germany was fighting on three fronts, its transportation network crippled by Allied bombing, its factories struggling to replace losses, its economy stretched beyond breaking. The Wehrmacht still had excellent soldiers, brilliant commanders, formidable weapons, but it could not supply them. Panzer divisions sat immobilized for lack of fuel. Infantry units went hungry. Ammunition was rationed. Spare parts were scavenged from wrecked vehicles. The logistics that had once been Germany's strength had become its fatal weakness, and into this equation came the Americans. The American military-industrial complex in 1944 was the most powerful economic engine in human history. Between 1942 and 1945, the United States produced nearly 300,000 aircraft, 88,000 tanks, 3 million machine guns, 41 billion rounds of ammunition, 2.6 million trucks, and 6,500 naval vessels. It fed not only its own military, but also the armies of Britain, the Soviet Union, France, and a dozen other nations. It did this while maintaining civilian living standards that were, paradoxically, higher than they had been during the Depression. Americans in 1944 ate better, earned more, and enjoyed greater material comfort than Americans in 1939. The war had not impoverished the nation. It had enriched it, but production was only half the equation. The other half was delivery, and it was in delivery, in the unglamorous, uncinematic work of logistics, that the Americans achieved something unprecedented in military history. The man who made it possible was a general whose name is largely forgotten today. Bryan Burke Somervell, commander of Army Service Forces, the organization responsible for supplying the American military. Somervell was not a combat officer. He had never led troops into battle, never commanded a division. He was an engineer, a West Point graduate, who had made his reputation building infrastructure projects during the Depression. He was a bureaucrat, a logistician, a man who thought in terms of tonnages and throughput and transportation networks. And he was a genius. Somervell understood that modern war was a problem of industrial organization. The factory worker in Detroit assembling engines was as important as the tank commander in Normandy. The shipping clerk in Baltimore managing manifests was as vital as the supply sergeant at the front. The entire system, from raw materials to finished products to delivery to deployment, had to function as a single integrated machine. Any bottleneck, any inefficiency, any delay would cascade through the system and weaken the Army at the point of contact. So Somervell built a system. He standardized everything: parts, procedures, packaging, paperwork. He created a global network of supply depots, transportation hubs, and distribution centers. He applied assembly line principles to military logistics. He measured everything, optimized everything, eliminated waste at every level. And most importantly, he created redundancy. If one route was blocked, there were two others. If one supplier failed, there were three backups. The system was designed to absorb shocks, to keep flowing no matter what obstacles it encountered. By June 1944, that system was moving 50,000 tons of supplies per day across the Atlantic. Within 6 months of D-Day, it would be moving 800,000 tons per month into France alone. Nothing like it had ever existed. Werner Schulze was not the only German engineer stunned by what he saw. As the Allies pushed inland from Normandy, German officers at every level began to encounter evidence of American logistical capacity. They found supply dumps the size of small cities, with inventories that would have sustained an entire German army group for months. They captured American trucks and discovered they were superior to German trucks, more reliable, easier to maintain, standardized so that any part could fit any vehicle. They examined American ration crates and found not just food but luxuries: canned meat, fruit cocktail, candy, toilet paper. Each American soldier received more calories per day than a German officer. But it was the speed that shocked them most. The speed at which supplies moved from ship to shore to front line. The speed at which damaged equipment was repaired or replaced. The speed at which entire divisions could be redeployed, supplied, and sent back into action. General Major Fritz Bayerlein, commander of the Panzerlehr Division, one of the Wehrmacht's elite armored units, wrote in his war diary after engaging American forces in July 1944, "We are not fighting an army. We are fighting a factory. For every tank we destroy, 2 more appear. For every truck we disable, 5 more arrive. Their supply columns stretch back to the horizon. We cannot win a war of attrition against a nation that treats war materiel as disposable." Bayerlein was a veteran of the Afrika Korps, a man who had fought under Rommel, who had seen the British Eighth Army at its best. But even the British, supplied by American Lend-Lease, had never demonstrated this kind of logistical dominance. The Americans were operating at a scale and speed that defied European military experience. The symbol of American logistics, the object that appeared in every memoir, every report, every account by German soldiers who encountered American supply lines, was the jerrycan. Ironically, the jerrycan was a German invention designed in 1937 by engineer Vinzenz Grünvogel. It was a marvel of functional design. A 20-liter fuel container with 3 handles so it could be carried by 1 or 2 men, an air pocket to allow for expansion, a cross-stamped design for structural strength, and a cam lever closure that could be opened without tools. The British and Americans, who had been using flimsy, leak-prone fuel cans, recognized the jerrycan's superiority immediately and began producing their own versions. By 1944, the Americans were manufacturing jerrycans by the millions. They were everywhere, stacked on trucks, slung on tanks, lined up at supply depots, carried by infantry. They became the universal symbol of American abundance. While German units were siphoning fuel from abandoned vehicles and hoarding every liter, American units had jerrycans by the hundreds, filled and ready, delivered as casually as if fuel were water. Oberst Hans von Luck, commander of the 125th Panzer Grenadier Regiment, later recalled an incident in August 1944. His unit had ambushed an American supply convoy and destroyed several trucks. When his soldiers searched the wreckage, they found 40 jerrycans of gasoline, enough to keep his entire regiment mobile for 3 days. But what struck him was not the quantity. It was the wastefulness. The Americans had been transporting that fuel to a forward depot that already had thousands of jerrycans in stock. They had fuel to spare. They had fuel to burn, literally. Von Luck wrote in his memoirs, "We realized then that we were not just fighting a richer enemy. We were fighting an enemy for whom the very concept of scarcity was alien. They did not think in terms of rationing or conserving or making do. They thought in terms of surplus, and that surplus was their secret weapon." The contrast between German and American logistics was not merely a matter of scale, it was a matter of philosophy. German logistics were based on the principle of efficiency, doing more with less, maximizing the use of limited resources, maintaining strict discipline over supply chains. This worked when Germany was on the offensive, when it could capture enemy supplies, when its enemies were weaker. But by 1944, Germany was on the defensive, its resources depleted, its infrastructure crumbling. Efficiency was no longer enough. American logistics were based on the principle of abundance, producing more than was needed, building redundancy into the system, accepting waste as the price of reliability. This was possible because American industrial capacity was so vast that waste was affordable. Better to have too much than too little. Better to oversupply and discard the surplus than to risk shortage at a critical moment. This principle extended to every aspect of the supply chain. American trucks were not designed to last for years, like German trucks. They were designed to be cheap, easy to produce, and simple to maintain. When one broke down, it was often easier to abandon it and requisition a new one than to repair it. This horrified German engineers, who had been trained to treat every vehicle as precious. But from an American perspective, it made perfect sense. Why spend hours repairing a truck when a new one could be delivered in days? Why tie up mechanics and spare parts when replacement was faster and easier? The same logic applied to everything. Ammunition, food, clothing, weapons, all were produced in such quantities that soldiers could afford to be careless. Lost your rifle? Here's another. Ran out of ammo? Here's 10,000 rounds. Need winter clothing? Here are 500 overcoats. Pick one that fits. This abundance had a psychological effect that went beyond mere material advantage. American soldiers fought with the confidence that came from knowing they would be supplied, that they would be fed, that if they were wounded they would be cared for, that if their equipment broke it would be replaced. They did not have to worry about conservation or scarcity. They could focus entirely on the mission. German soldiers, by contrast, fought under the constant anxiety of shortage. They hoarded ammunition. They scavenged food. They patched their uniforms and repaired their boots and nursed their vehicles along. They were good at it. Necessity had made them experts in improvisation. But improvisation was exhausting. It was a tax on morale, a constant reminder that their nation could no longer support them. The Red Ball Express was perhaps the purest expression of American logistical philosophy. Established in August 1944, it was a dedicated trucking route running from the Normandy beaches to the advancing Allied armies, operating 24 hours a day. At its peak, it employed 6,000 trucks, driven by predominantly African-American soldiers, moving 2,500 tons of supplies per day over distances of up to 400 miles. The trucks traveled in convoys, spaced at 60-yard intervals, averaging 25 miles per hour. The route was one-way, different roads for northbound and southbound traffic, and was given absolute priority. All other traffic, civilian and military, had to yield. German intelligence officers monitoring the Red Ball Express could not believe the reports. A dedicated highway system running day and night, delivering thousands of tons per day over distances that would have required a major logistics operation in the Wehrmacht, and the Americans were doing it as a routine matter. Without apparent strain, Oberst Wilhelm von Schramm, a staff officer with Army Group B, obtained photographs of Red Ball convoys and showed them to his superior, General Feldmarschall Walter Model. Model studied the photographs in silence, then said, "They have motorized their entire supply system. We are still using horses. This is not a war between armies. This is a war between centuries." He was not exaggerating. In 1944, the Wehrmacht still relied on horses for much of its logistics. More than 80% of its transport was horse-drawn. The German army that invaded Russia in 1941 had brought 750,000 horses with it. Horses required fodder, rest, veterinary care. They moved slowly. They were vulnerable to weather and disease. They belonged to the 19th century. The American Army used trucks. Specifically, it used the GMC CCKW, a 2.5-ton 6-6 cargo truck that became the workhorse of Allied logistics. The Americans produced 562,750 of them during the war. They were reliable, rugged, capable of operating in any terrain and any weather. They could carry 3 tons of cargo at 50 miles per hour, and they were everywhere. German engineers who examined captured CCKWs were impressed by their engineering, but also disturbed by their implications. These were not precision machines. They were mass-produced, designed for quantity over quality. But they worked, and there were so many of them that it didn't matter if some broke down. The system absorbed the failures and kept moving. By September 1944, the Allied advance had outrun its supply lines. The armies that had broken out of Normandy in August had moved so fast, 200 miles in 2 weeks, that the logistics system, impressive as it was, could not keep up. Fuel ran short. Ammunition was rationed. The advance stalled. General Patton's Third Army, which had been racing toward the German border, ground to a halt not because of German resistance, but because of empty fuel tanks. For a brief moment, German commanders allowed themselves to hope. The Americans had overextended. Their logistics had finally failed them. Perhaps the Wehrmacht could counterattack, could exploit this weakness, could turn the tide. But within 10 days, the supply situation had stabilized. Fuel flowed again. Ammunition stocks rebuilt. The advance resumed. The Americans had not failed. They had merely paused. The system had flexed, adjusted, and continued. Werner Schulze, now working in a logistics planning office in Berlin, received reports of the September supply crisis and the subsequent recovery. He wrote in a letter to a colleague, "They can afford to make mistakes. They can afford to fail, because their reserves are so deep that failure is temporary. We cannot afford a single mistake. Every error is permanent. That is the difference between us." The final proof of American logistical superiority came during the Battle of the Bulge. On December 16, 1944, the Wehrmacht launched its last major offensive in the West, a desperate gamble to split the Allied armies and capture the port of Antwerp. The attack achieved tactical surprise. German forces broke through American lines, created a bulge 50 miles deep, surrounded the town of Bastogne, and threatened to shatter the Allied front. For a week, it appeared the offensive might succeed. But then the weather cleared, Allied air power returned, and the logistics system responded. Within 48 hours of the German attack, the Americans had redirected entire supply columns, rerouted hundreds of thousands of tons of materiel, and delivered fuel, ammunition, and reinforcements to the threatened sectors. Patton's Third Army, which had been advancing east, was turned 90 degrees north and sent to relieve Bastogne. The movement of an entire army, 250,000 men, thousands of vehicles, hundreds of tanks, was accomplished in 3 days. German planners had estimated it would take the Americans at least a week to respond to the offensive, possibly 2. The speed of the American reaction shocked them. It should not have been possible. Moving an army was not like moving a truck. It required planning, coordination, communication, supply, yet the Americans had done it as if it were routine. General Major Karl Wagner, Chief of Staff of 5th Panzer Army, later testified, "We knew the Americans were well supplied, but we believed their logistics were rigid, that they could not adapt quickly to changing circumstances. We were wrong. Their system was flexible, responsive, almost organic. They moved supplies and armies with the same ease that we moved regiments. It was the final demonstration of their superiority." The Battle of the Bulge ended in January 1945. The Wehrmacht had expended its last reserves of men, fuel, and equipment. The offensive had failed not because of any single battle, but because the Germans could not sustain it. They ran out of fuel. They ran out of ammunition. They ran out of time. The Americans, meanwhile, absorbed the shock, rebuilt their lines, and continued their advance. As the war entered its final months, German engineers and logistics officers were forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. They had been taught, had believed with absolute certainty, that German engineering was the best in the world. German precision, German efficiency, German discipline, these were supposed to be unmatched. And in many respects, they were. German tanks were superior to American tanks. German machine guns were more reliable. German optics were better. German soldiers were often better trained. But none of it mattered, because the Americans had something more important than superior individual weapons. They had a superior system. They had the ability to produce vast quantities of adequate equipment and deliver it to the right place at the right time. They had the industrial capacity to absorb losses and keep fighting. They had the logistical infrastructure to sustain a war on 2 fronts simultaneously, across 2 oceans, against 3 enemies, while maintaining civilian prosperity at home. Major General Erich Schneider, a logistics officer who survived the war and later worked with the U.S. Army in occupied Germany, wrote in a 1948 report, "We German officers prided ourselves on our professionalism, our training, our tactical skill. We looked down on the Americans as amateurs, as businessmen playing at war. But we failed to understand that modern war is business. It is production and distribution and inventory management on a continental scale. The Americans were not amateurs. They were professionals of a different kind, and we had no answer to them." The jerry can remained the symbol. After the war, millions of them remained scattered across Europe, repurposed by farmers, drivers, homeowners. They outlasted the armies that had used them, outlasted the nations that had produced them. They were practical, functional, efficient, a small example of good design multiplied by industrial capacity. But they represented something larger. They represented the idea that abundance could be a strategy, that logistics could be a weapon, that the prosaic work of supply and transportation could win wars more decisively than heroism or genius. The German engineers who examined those jerry cans on Omaha Beach, who studied American supply depots, who watched Red Ball convoys rolling past, understood this. They understood that they had been outmatched not by better soldiers, but by a better system. Some of them, like Werner Schulze, survived the war. Schulze returned to Berlin to find his city in ruins, his university destroyed, his profession discredited. He was interrogated by American officers, who asked him detailed questions about German logistics, about supply chains, about production capacity. He answered honestly. He had nothing left to protect. One American officer, a captain named Richard Morrison, who had been a logistics planner, showed Schulze photographs of American supply depots in France. Tens of thousands of jerry cans stacked in pyramids. Mountains of crates, acres of vehicles. Morrison asked, "Did you ever see anything like this on the German side?" Schulze looked at the photographs for a long time. Then he said, "No, never. We could not have imagined it. We thought we understood logistics. We thought we were the best. But you Americans were playing a different game. You were not trying to be efficient. You were trying to be overwhelming. And you succeeded," Morrison nodded. Then he said something Schulze never forgot. "We didn't win because we were smarter. We won because we could afford to be careless. That's what abundance means. It means you don't have to be perfect." In the years after the war, as Germany rebuilt under American aid, as the Marshall Plan poured billions of dollars into European recovery, as German engineers studied American methods and adapted them to European industry, the lessons of wartime logistics were not forgotten. German industry, reconstructed with American assistance, adopted American techniques: standardization, mass production, supply chain management, inventory control. The Wirtschaftswunder, the German economic miracle of the 1950s and 60s, was built in part on the foundation of logistical principles that Germans had learned from their conquerors. Werner Schulze found work with a transportation company, helping to rebuild Germany's shattered road and rail networks. He never spoke much about the war, but he kept a single jerry can in his office, a relic from 1944. When colleagues asked about it, he would say only, "It reminds me of what is possible when you think differently." What he meant was this: that abundance is not merely having more. It is thinking in terms of more. It is designing systems that assume plenty rather than scarcity, that build in redundancy rather than efficiency, that accept waste as the price of reliability. It is the opposite of the German mindset that had been trained to conserve, to husband resources, to extract maximum performance from minimum input. Both approaches have their virtues, but in total war, in a contest of industrial civilizations, abundance wins. Not because it is morally superior, but because it is materially unstoppable. The jerry can sits in museums now, displayed alongside tanks and rifles and uniforms, identified with a small plaque explaining its history. Visitors walk past it without much notice. It is not dramatic. It does not inspire awe. It is just a fuel container. But to the German engineers who saw them stacked by the thousands on Normandy Beach, who watched them being casually discarded by American units that had more in reserve, who calculated what those millions of jerry cans represented in terms of industrial output and logistical capability, to them, the jerrycan was more significant than any weapon. It was proof that the war was already lost, because wars are not won by the brave alone, nor by the brilliant. They are won by the side that can deliver more men, more materiel, more supplies, more consistently, over longer distances, with fewer interruptions, for a longer time. They are won by logistics, by mathematics, by the unglamorous work of planning and transportation and inventory management. The Germans had been very good at this once, but the Americans were better. Not because American engineers were smarter. In many cases, they were not. Not because American workers were more skilled. Often, they were less experienced. But because America had something Germany lacked: an industrial base so vast, so secure, so productive, that it could afford to be wasteful. It could afford to oversupply. It could afford redundancy. It could afford mistakes. And in war, the side that can afford mistakes usually wins. There is a photograph, taken in May 1945, of American and Soviet soldiers meeting at the Elbe River. They are shaking hands, celebrating the end of the war in Europe. Behind them, on the American side, supply trucks stretch back to the horizon. On the Soviet side, there are horse-drawn carts. Both nations had defeated Germany, but only one had done so while its soldiers ate chocolate and smoked cigarettes and drank Coca-Cola. Werner Schulze saw that photograph in a newspaper years later. By then, he was an old man, retired, living in a small apartment in Frankfurt. He cut the photograph out and pinned it to his wall. Not out of bitterness, he was long past bitterness, but out of respect. Respect for the system that had defeated him. Respect for the engineers and planners and truck drivers and dock workers who had built and operated that system. Respect for the idea that logistics, unsexy and unheroic as it was, had changed the course of history. He wrote in his diary, one of his last entries, "We lost the war in June 1944, on Omaha Beach, though we did not know it yet. We lost it the moment we saw what the Americans could deliver. Not just soldiers and tanks, but everything. Everything an army needs, everything a nation can produce, delivered across an ocean, onto a hostile shore, and sustained indefinitely. We had nothing to match it. We never had a chance." And then, in a line that might have been resignation, or might have been something like wonder, "They did not just defeat us. They taught us what was possible. The jerry can. Simple, functional, mass-produced. Symbol of an economy at war, of a nation so powerful it could supply not just its own armies, but its allies. Of a philosophy that said abundance was a virtue, waste was acceptable, and more was always better than just enough." In the end, it was not courage that won the war. It was not tactics or technology or individual genius. It was logistics. It was the ability to move faster, supply better, produce more. It was the ability to turn an entire nation into a factory, and a factory into a weapon. The German engineers admitted it. Not immediately, not willingly, but eventually, inevitably, because the evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. The Americans had moved faster than any army in history, not because their soldiers marched faster or their vehicles drove faster, but because their supply chains operated faster. And in doing so, they had redefined what war could be, what victory required, what a modern nation at full mobilization could achieve. The jerrycan endures. The lesson endures, that wars are won in factories and warehouses and on highways as much as on battlefields, that the nation which feeds its armies best, supplies them most reliably, wastes them most carelessly, often prevails. That abundance, properly wielded, is the ultimate force multiplier. And that sometimes the most revolutionary weapon is not a weapon at all, but a 20-liter fuel container, multiplied by 1,000,000, delivered on time, every time, without fail.